Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of February 26, 2026. We are coming to you again this week from the Semi-Quincentennial Division here at the Georgia Historical Society. In our ongoing commemoration of the US 250, my very special guest today is author and historian Andrew Burstein, who joins us today to talk about his new book on Thomas Jefferson. Andrew Burstein recently retired as the Charles P. Manship Professor of History at Louisiana State University. Educated at Hackley School in Tarrytown, New York, he received a B.A. in Oriental Studies from Columbia University, an M.A. from the Center for Chinese Studies at the University of Michigan, and a Ph.D. in History from the University of Virginia. He served as an advisor as well as an on-camera commentator on Ken Burns' 1997 film Thomas Jefferson, and was featured on C-SPAN's American President series and was interviewed on C-SPAN's Book Notes by Brian Lamb about his book America's Jubilee, as well as appearing on numerous NPR programs. Andrew Burstein is the author of many books on American history, including The Inner Jefferson, Portrait of a Grieving Optimist, published by the University of Virginia Press in 1995, Sentimental Democracy, The Evolution of America's Romantic Self-Image, published by Hill and Wang in 1999. America's Jubilee, How in 1826 a Generation Remembered 50 Years of Independence, published by Alfred A. Knopf in 2001. The Passions of Andrew Jackson, published by Knopf in 2003. Jefferson's Secrets, Death and Desire at Monticello, published by Basic Books in 2005. The Original Knickerbocker, The Life of Washington Irving, published by Basic Books in 2007. Lincoln Dreamt He Died, The Midnight Visions of Remarkable Americans from Colonial Times to the Present, published by St. Martin's Press in 2013. Democracy's Muse, How Thomas Jefferson Became an FDR Liberal, a Reagan Republican, and a Tea Party fanatic, all the while being dead, published by the University of Virginia Press in 2015. Longing for Connection, Entangled Memories and Emotional Loss in Early America, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2024. Andrew Burstein is the co-editor with his partner Nancy Eisenberg of two books. The first, Mortal Remains, Death in Early America, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2002, and Rip Van Winkle's Republic, Washington Irving in History and Memory, published by LSU Press in 2022. He also co-authored two additional books with Nancy Eisenberg. The first, Madison and Jefferson, published by Random House in 2010, and The Problem of Democracy, The President's Atoms Confront the Cult of Personality, published by Viking in 2019. Well, as you can hear, Andy Burstein is one of the nation's most prolific scholars and distinguished experts on Thomas Jefferson. His most recent book, and the one he is here to talk with me about today, is entitled Being Thomas Jefferson, An Intimate History, published by Bloomsbury on January 13th, 2026. My conversation with Andrew Burstein begins now. Andy Burstein, welcome to our podcast.
I'm delighted to be with you, Stan.
You have spent a career studying Thomas Jefferson. I know you have ventured down other alleys as well. I have read your biography of Washington Irving, loved it. You have written about Abraham Lincoln. You've written about Andrew Jackson. But it's Jefferson, I think, where you began, and I think you say somewhere in this new book that this is your final word on Jefferson, and it is a monumental task that you have taken on in your new book, Being Thomas Jefferson. So let's just jump right in here. I want to begin sort of where you began. You first start talking about Fawn Brodie and her path-breaking book from 1974. Tell our audience, who are not so versed as perhaps you and I are in the literature of Jefferson, who Fawn Brodie was and what she did and what you're trying to do building upon her.
Fawn Brodie was someone who irritated the living experts in Jefferson's humanity by associating him in 1974 with what was then considered to be unlikely liaison with Sally Hemings, his enslaved seamstress, who was also his dead wife's half sister. So it's a complicated emotional story. And she was the first historian. She taught at UCLA. And although she didn't have a PhD in history, she rose to be a full professor at a research institution of some note. So she was very visible. And what she did as a psychohistorian, the psychohistory was not looked down upon then as it came to be and still is. And in a way, this book, my title is almost identical to hers 50 years later. It's kind of an homage to Fawn Brodie because she opened up the inner Jefferson as a psychological subject. She was, I would say, mired in Freudian analysis, and that's where she went wrong. But that doesn't mean that she was mistaken in characterizing him as a psychologically complex human being who, and it's a story of, as my book is, a story of his self-government in the most literal sense. We associate Jefferson with the political ideal of liberty, of democracy, of self-government. And so where my book mirrors hers or echoes hers is as a study of Thomas Jefferson's personal self-government.
Getting to know another human being who is alive and well and sitting across from us can be very, very difficult at its best. Getting to know someone who's been dead for 200 years can seem almost impossible. How does one go about writing what you call in your subtitle an intimate history of somebody who other biographers, one of whom you studied under, Merrill Peterson, said he's the hardest of all of our founders to get inside of, to get to know.
Yes, and that was a remarkable admission by Merrill Peterson, whose 1,000-page biography of Jefferson, which was published in 1970, is still an excellent and very readable single volume biography. Merrill Peterson, I first met when I was a first year graduate student, and he had already at University of Virginia, and he had already retired, and he wasn't interested in Jefferson anymore. He had moved on to Lincoln and was writing a book called Lincoln in Historical Memory, and it's another wonderful book. His Bancroft Prize-winning first book in 1960 was The Jefferson Image in the American Mind,
Hmm.
which traced Jefferson's legacy from 1826 to the New Deal era. So, yes, Merrill gave me his blessing to go ahead with this project. I was writing under his successor as the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation Professor of History at UVA, and that's Peter Onuf. And Peter is known these days as the sort of the dean of Jefferson studies. He's written quite a lot and is one of the most remarkable scholars I've ever met. Well, having thanked those great minds who precede me, what I do is pair historical memory and emotional identity. I've done that throughout my career. And I focus on the American Enlightenment, not only as it's more familiarly known as an intellectual and philosophical movement, but as a sensation-driven movement, the medical Enlightenment that focused on the language of sensation, of sentiment, and studying the human condition, both the bodily condition of human beings and social. So the nervous sympathy that, courses through the system. Bodily sympathies and social sympathies are related. And this appears constantly in the writings of Thomas Jefferson, who is arguably, or I might say definitively, the most expressive, emotionally expressive, certainly in the language that he uses, among his generation of the political elite. And yes, he's elusive as a, a human being because his capacity to move people with language was such that he could write in his, I mean, we have something like 18,000 of his personal letters that are extant. And we find drafts of letters because he made copies, and it shows where he crosses something out and inserts something else. Um, he's definitely well organized, over organized, catalogs, tabulates, lists, and he's a bibliophile. So, you see him on the move constantly without even leaving his cabinet, as he called his study at Monticello. And he disguises in what he writes his private ambition. And in person, he's a very mild, not very forthcoming individual. At first, on first meeting, he seems cold, aloof, but you get to know him and you see him the way he is on the page, which is to say, seductive. He's a seductive letter writer and a seductive speech writer. And he lived at a time when what you set on the page defined your public reputation. It was not a visual media driven world as the one we know, but one that lived on the page. And what was in the newspapers went far to determine how you were viewed. So to jump ahead a little bit and mention Jefferson's political identity, his partisan identity, when something he wrote that was not intended for publication was leaked to the press, as happened on a few significant occasions in his career, it made him the most controversial figure of the age, just as Andrew Jackson would become the most controversial figure of his age. Celebrity, public identity has defined how we know our presidents or our historical figures. And it presents to the biographer an immense challenge, but one that I've really enjoyed doing. As I said, my overarching focus or process involves pairing historical memory with emotional identity, trying to understand what the life of the mind was like in 1776 or 1836, and how each generation recast emotions by looking at how words change, how emotional words are witnesses, and words are registers of societal and emotional changes. And so studying 18th century American English and looking at Jefferson's particular talent therein helps bring back to life, to resuscitate the emotional world as it was expressed the way it had the most impact back then, which is language on the page. It's a typographical age. Book reading, book collecting defined the intellectual elite. And the intellectual elite and the political elite are almost inseparable. Whereas today we have a much greater um, diffusion of knowledge than they did at that time, when you wouldn't speak of a middle class the way you do today. The political elite, the intellectual elite, most of the people who were at the Constitutional Convention went to college at a time when, I don't know, 1 or 2% of Americans had that good fortune to attend college.
Hmm. And you make it a point to say that in many ways Jefferson was his own worst enemy because he committed his thoughts to paper, probably sometimes when he shouldn't have. The famous, I guess it's Philip Mazzei letter about George Washington, and we'll talk about that and how he always sort of dissembled when he was called out on these things. But you talk about the power of his writing and his language is one reason that we both revere him, and he also has a target on his back. We don't quote James Monroe. We very rarely quote Madison, but we quote Jefferson on almost everything. His
Yes,
language.
yes. And this is because he uh, both knew how to reach the public on an emotional level in way, and this is the reason why he was chosen to write the Declaration of Independence, because it wasn't simply a legal document. It wasn't only meant to convince in the court of public opinion on the basis of rational um, elements. It was also meant to encourage young men to sign up and join the Continental Army. And I mean, the reason why the Marquis de Lafayette at the age of 19 came to America and with a shipload of soldiers and gave uh, himself over to George Washington and became the youngest general in the Continental Army as a result of his contributions. Um, he read the Declaration of Independence, and it moved him. So moved him that he crossed an ocean to
Mm.
fight on behalf before the French joined the war effort a couple years later. So, um, so Jefferson's lyricism extended from personal correspondence, and much of what is quoted of Jefferson today, whether in Congress or just in on the internet, um, at least that which is not specious, because there's a lot of Jefferson quotes going around that Monticello has uh, fingered and
Mm.
shown to be made up. But um, yeah, so he wrote. A good example is when he writes and delivers in one of his rare personal, because he was not a speech maker. He had a small, soft voice. His first inaugural address as president in March 1801, where he declares, which something that comes across in his personal letters as well, harmony and affection, that what makes the American Republic special and why I consider the whole ideal of American exceptionalism to have originated with Thomas Jefferson, the harmony and affection without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. So he taps into the Enlightenment spirit of human dignity. And it's also why he comes across as the first um, man of the people in American history. And one of the things I do in this book is show how deliberate this is, that he is deeply conscious of his public reputation, and he is throughout his life. And no one has said this before, but I think I've presented enough evidence that this is a man who courted, who sought celebrity, And while on the outside, he appeared reticent, he, behind the scenes, he encouraged younger, rising generation of politicos to do his bidding, to take chances so that he didn't have to. He wanted to, he deliberately, he said to Madison and others, I want to keep my name out of the newspapers. So he's very thin-skinned, and yet he has this driving ambition to realize his ideal of the American Republic that we want to believe America is or can be. The patriotic language that he has contributed is, I think, underappreciated. So once again, um, it's that words are witnesses to the emotional change that you can look at on a national level. Like, what is the language of patriotism? Where does it derive from? And I can trace a lot of that as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence to Jefferson's emotive power on the page.
And we could talk all day about where he got that from and how he was so different from people like Washington or Henry or even George Wythe, people who came out of the same place that he did. And was he just sort of this unicorn? I'd love to know your thoughts on that in terms of what formed him and where did this skill with language. Well, maybe I'll just ask you. So, because where else am I going to get the chance to talk to Andy Burstein? Where did this skill with language come from? It obviously was something he worked hard at. He read voraciously. We know when you think of Jefferson, you think of books almost always. But how was he able to do this in a way? And the whole idea of patriotism, why did it attach to him in a way that it didn't, or did it? And it didn't attach to other people who came from the same place he did.
Yeah, it's a huge question, and I can only answer it partially. I think uh, the book as a whole will engage with it on various levels. So let
Hmm.
me just say here that language was an intoxicating field in the 18th century. So he wasn't alone. There were plenty of, and most of what he read was from England or France, the continent. There was precious little being published in late colonial America, and it wasn't really until the 1790s that, when he was already a political superstar, that the book publishing profession expanded in America. He was importing books from London and elsewhere when he was a college student at William and Mary between the age of 1721. By 1776, he had about 1,500 volumes at Monticello already, which was astounding if you think that his father was considered a well-read man, a book collector on the frontier of central Virginia. And he only owned, I think it was like 43 books.
Hmm.
Now, Jefferson, well, let's go back to his early life then, because this will at least give a good impression of how his mind evolved. Because both his mother and father, although I show that they didn't weigh heavily in his life as you know, in child rearing. His father was away from and died when Jefferson was 14. So although his father was a member of the House of Burgesses, he was on the road mapping Virginia and the distant borders. He was not at home much, and young Thomas, the eldest son, there were two older uh, sisters, one of whom died tragically in 1765. So he was surrounded by death, as everyone else was in his time. And that's also a key element that I bring out in fleshing out Jefferson's approach to life, death, and everything in between. But uh, he didn't know his father very well. I don't know how much bonding they could have done. He tells us very little about his father, nothing that could be construed as an emotional bond or anything really, other than that he was 10 years old. His father gave him a hunting rifle and told him to go out in the mountains on his own and you know, and become a man, shoot something. So, and his mother, who died in March of 1776, in the first chapter of the book, I question just what that relationship was like, because although she had a life interest in the property, and that included the enslaved people that Jefferson inherited, um, he only says that her Randolph genealogy. Randolph was one of the first families of Virginia, and he is intimate with Randolph's uh, multi-generational Randolphs. Um, they were important to him, but his own mother, a Randolph, Jane Randolph Jefferson, um, he he situated her in the Monticello Cemetery at a good distance from those most intimate with him. And I can only speculate. There's no written evidence, but I can only speculate that this micromanager is directing some slave to dig a grave, and he knows exactly where he wants everyone buried. So his wife dies in 1782. She's, you know, right next to him. His best friend, who died before the war, before in what 1773, his best friend and brother-in-law, Dabney Carr, is buried on the other side of her. So he's the first to be interred there, and he's very close um, to Jefferson's position in the middle. And then the other closest members of the family surround him immediately, um, his daughters. Well, his mother is a good 10, 12 feet away, and she's buried next to some distant cousins that there's very little tie to, either um, for her or for him. And these people are buried while Jefferson is still alive. So it's strange. It is strange that situating his mother where he does. Well, he identified with surrogate fathers. George Wythe, you mentioned, is probably the most determinative. Wythe, also a signer of the Declaration, taught him the law. Jefferson lived with Wythe for a good amount of time before he hit the road and began to practice law full time. It was his main occupation until about 1773, 74, when he turned to politics full time. So uh, Peyton Randolph, who was the first president of the Continental Congress, was another he looked up to. Edmund Randolph, that was a Tory who was the Attorney General before 1776, and Jefferson and he were close. Um, his son, Edmund Randolph, was in the George Washington's cabinet with Jefferson. So the people he was surrounded with were classmates at William and Mary, some of whom were lifelong friends, and he wrote some of the most nostalgic letters of his life to them. Others were men of his senior, the generation directly preceding his, who were his political mentors, you might say, as well, intellectual and political. So he then becomes a mentor as he gets into his 30s and 40s and mentors James Monroe, whom you also mentioned, probably among the founding generation, one of the least intellectually significant, but a war hero, you might, in his own way. And just after he was wounded at the Battle of Monmouth, he comes back and to Virginia and becomes Jefferson's right-hand man when Jefferson is the governor of Virginia, wartime, and goes on secret missions for the governor. So, yes, Jefferson is constantly attaching himself to people, and friendship is a way to understand him in a very positive way, that he trusts his friends and you might say that as he becomes a national figure and starts to believe that he himself is, after Washington dies in 1799, and then he becomes, in his own mind, the Republic's savior. And this is another fascinating element, major theme in my book, how he comes to the point of perceiving himself as the savior of the American Republic, that he alone is going to stop moneyed aristocracy, and without him, monarchy could reemerge in America. And in some ways, then he goes off the deep end, and he needs James Madison to pull him back. Madison is his conscience. Madison is the only person, I would say, who can draw Jefferson down, who can say, Mr. Jefferson, reevaluate what you're thinking here. I mean, my partner Nancy Eisenberg and I wrote a book that was published in 2010 called Madison and Jefferson, about that 50-year relationship. Madison is one of the most fascinating people who is poorly understood, because he was not just the cerebral dude who teamed up with Hamilton to write the Federalist Papers, which basically over the course of a career was like what he wrote over a weekend. It didn't at all, even though this is how he and Hamilton get quoted. It's just a very small slice of who they were as thinkers and actors. And another reason why in this 250th anniversary year, we should be paying more attention to how our texts have grossly oversimplified who our founders were and what drove them. When I say we oversimplify, I go so far as to say that blaming Jefferson, a lifelong slave owner, for failing to address this issue that commands our attention, why was that on the back burner then? And before we pass judgment, shouldn't we try to understand the ways in which, I mean, he was in a way cowardly for failing to act, but so was George Washington. And Washington, because he's not the emotional founder, Jefferson is. Jefferson, writes about human dignity in such a way, and the language of human rights, that we have expectations from him and single him out instead of seeing him as, a garden variety slave owner who identified with his fellow patricians. They were aristocrats, and his class identity meant a lot more than we of the modern age pay attention to when we look at the founders. So there's so many levels on which to treat their psychology and and weigh their responsibility for producing both the good and the evil that America has become. Well, I've gone on a little long.
No, no, no. This is all fascinating, and it plays right into what I was about to talk about with you, which is um, over the course of this book, and there are 323 pages of text. There's a nice introduction. There are footnotes, which I would encourage any reader to read as well, because there's so much information there and things that you tease out of the sources. This is well rounded, though, to your point. So when Fawn Brodie wrote her book in 1974, we were 2 years away from the bicentennial, and the founders occupied a very different place in American cultural life then. They were sort of placed upon a pedestal, especially with us coming out of Watergate, the sense of declension in American political life from where we had begun with Washington and Jefferson to Nixon and, Gerald Ford presiding over the bicentennial. These seemed like pygmies. But one of the things you've done, and one of the things historians in general have done in the 50 years since, is to make these people more rounded human beings. You have, this is, in getting into Jefferson's personal life and the public life and how those two matched up. I want to quote one of the things you said in talking about Washington and Jefferson. You said, Washington, Jefferson, and their ilk were conformists. We don't have to, and you put quote, we don't have to like them to study the conflicts and personal trials they faced as public figures. And it surprised me a little bit that you waited. That's on page 308, that long to sort of free yourself from the idea that you owe the public the idea that they're going to come to this book and read about Jefferson the Magnificent. What you've really done is distill, I think, your lifetime of intimacy with this figure. And in some ways, and I talked about this with you at the beginning, I jotted down some notes on the fly leave of this book. After reading a good bit of this, it seemed to me that you were exasperated with Thomas Jefferson. And I wrote hypocrisy, of course, but also smugness, controlling, needy, blind, or indifferent to evidence of anything that contradicted what he believed. Jefferson was hyperbolic, cold-blooded, unfeeling, peevish. He could rationalize anything. He held grudges till the end. And you say right off the bat in your introduction, what tends to be lost in the record is how stubbornly Jefferson resisted change. All of this, for a lot of people, and I don't mean to make this sound like you wrote a hatchet job. This is a well-balanced look, but you take him warts and all, and you make it a point to shine a light on the warts for people who might have overlooked all that because they see only a great man. That's a long setup to sort of asking you, am I right about that? You are somewhat exasperated, but at the end of the day, he was just a human being with all the foibles we all have.
Right. And in the Declaration and preceding that, in the 1774 Summary of the Rights of British America, which is a beautiful document, and I spend time on it because it explains the Declaration perfectly, both the historical antecedents of Jefferson's argument in the Declaration, but also his treatment of the king. So it's the language of feeling versus unfeeling. And if I'm disappointed in Jefferson, if that's your takeaway, or if that's a reader's takeaway, it's because he's so good at expressing the value of feeling for other humans and for humanity in general. And it accuses the king of being unfeeling, or the British of ignoring or turning from he calls them their unfeeling brethren, and a man who sees cruelty and calls it out, who wrote to John Adams later in their retirement years, bigotry is what does he say? It's a pathology. It's a problem in the mind, and it's a pathology. And he speaks in this medicalized, pathological, neurophysiological language. All the while, he's writing seductively to try to establish himself as someone who has profound feeling for others, right? The common man. So in politics, and that's largely what the words you use that are an accurate picture of my assessment of Jefferson as a public man. Um, it's how he harbors grudges, not just for Hamilton, which is over the course of the few years that they sparred in Washington's cabinet, it makes perfect sense. I mean, Hamilton won their Machiavellian battle for Washington's ear, and Jefferson was embittered. He went home to Monticello and swore he was going to stay out of politics forever, and told Madison, I want you to run for president in 1796. And that too is an aspect of Jefferson's character that I get pretty deeply into. But the So the way he treats Aaron Burr, his vice president, is indicative of all of those negatives that you list. With Burr, who literally makes Jefferson president because he delivers the state of New York, the swing state of New York, to Jefferson in 1800. And their tie in the Electoral College was accidental, and Burr did nothing, despite the gossip, which Jefferson conveniently comes to believe years later when he dismisses Burr from the ticket and goes with another New Yorker. The Virginia-New York political axis is something that lived on. And George Clinton, who became vice president in Jefferson's second term, was not charismatic as Burr was not young, was not intellectually threatening to Madison's succession. Jefferson dearly counted on the Virginia dynasty of presidents, the two terms of Jefferson, Madison, Monroe in succession. So he becomes president through some devious work in the Congress to break the tie, but Burr never tried. He stayed in Albany. He stayed away from where he could be politicking if he really wanted to unseat Jefferson. So he becomes vice president. Jefferson immediately denies him federal patronage power, makes him completely apart from decision making, much as John Adams's vice president, being of different emerging political parties, he suffered for this as a vice president without power. But Burr was loyal. And nevertheless, Jefferson gave him no power, no freedom, no attention. It was only after Burr's famous duel with Hamilton, when he's on the run. He's indicted in New York and New Jersey, but he's still vice president, and he's presiding over the trial of Samuel Chase, a member, an associate justice of the Supreme Court, who speaks against Jefferson, and Jefferson, wants him impeached because he's frustrated that he's only got both houses of Congress and the executive. He wants the Supreme Court too. So you get this different picture of Jefferson as a activist executive, and Burr acquits himself well in all respects. And then Jefferson starts to invite him to the president's house, where he thinks he can win him back. When he's already dismissed him, he's the outgoing or lame duck vice president, but he's killed Hamilton. And Jefferson says nothing about Hamilton's demise, but he's happy. And so Burr is suddenly welcomed back into the fold. Um, and then, without giving him any opportunity for a future in politics, Jefferson buys into the gossip he's hearing from Federalist circles largely of Burr launching a conspiracy to not only conquer Mexico, but uh, uh, attack New Orleans, and even return to Washington and unseat Jefferson by military means. And this is all crazy stuff. And yet Jefferson doesn't know how to listen to reason when he's faced with, well, I'll call it an emotional trauma. And the other thing that's really revealing about Jefferson as president, okay, it starts in 1764 when he first leaves the nest of George Wythe and goes out and practices law. He's a public man now. There's more on his plate. He begins to have what he calls periodical headaches. We call migraines, and they're severe. And when he's at Monticello, there's no record of it, right? That's um, his safe place where he's in charge, and he controls the environment, and he has his secret world there, a world of power, a world of class power. And now, as president, especially in his second term, he has more of these periodical headaches that send him into a darkened room in the president's house for 5, 6 hours a day for up to 2 to even 3 weeks in one case. And these migraines only cease in 1809 when he goes back to Monticello for good. When he retires from the presidency, Madison's running the show. So he never attaches any psychological um, rationale for the periodical headaches. He sees them purely as uh, some part of his uh, inherited medical condition that has nothing to do with psychology. So um, yeah, I mean, and the way he goes after John Marshall until the end of his years. I mean, he's frustrated because uh, Chief Justice John Marshall is going to outlive him, and Chief Justice John Marshall is going to tell the story of how Jefferson subverted George Washington. And Jefferson is desperate in his retirement years to find a biographer, and he seeks out at length another associate justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Johnson from South Carolina, William Johnson, whom he has appointed to the Supreme Court during his presidency, to write the history of their times, and that posterity should see Thomas Jefferson through Thomas Jefferson's eyes. Fortunately, unlike Aaron Burr, for example, or who has no offspring to write his story, so he goes down as a bad boy of the founders. Jefferson has his grandson and namesake, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, to lead the way and publish just a couple of years after Jefferson's death a selective 4 volume of letters. And also Jefferson is eager for posterity to read his original draft of the Declaration of Independence. Now that he's world famous for it, he wants the world to know that his draft was better than the final result of congressional editing. So, I mean, yeah, this is why Jefferson is fearful and also bent on retribution, vengeance, historical justification. So, uh, as a person, he's like most of us. He doesn't like to admit when he's wrong. There's no one on earth who's never told a lie. Um, and if he's this way, it doesn't mean he was a bad person because he was capable of profound love, affection, and what he wrote was not just to seduce. He believed in that lyrical, poetic perception of human value. He was a humanist. He didn't read all of those books from the ancient Greeks and Cicero, Montaigne, Locke, Lawrence Sterne. His uh, he was thin-skinned when he was criticized in one instance where his governorship was criticized, and he spent his lifetime looking for people to rewrite the story of his failed wartime governorship. That he wrote that only the all-healing grave would allow him to forget the insult to his reputation as governor. I mean, this is, 50 years later, basically. So, he is impassioned. He fears a loss of control over circumstances. It's a story. This book's a story of love and loss in equal measure. And I would say that he loses at love more than he he grieves more than he's able to appreciate. Even though he writes of Monticello in such a sublime way, he uses the word sublime to speak of his view from Monticello. And it is his dream world. Um, and he cherishes his privacy. We know too little about the relation, the 10-year marriage to his wife, whom he called Patty. We do know how he suffered for a long time after she died. And, there are reasons why he never remarried, because he could have rescued himself from debt if he had married another white um, upper class daughter of the planter set, and acquire uh, the land of her family. Um, but uh, he chose secrecy and privacy, which is to allude to his relationship with his enslaved wife's half sister, Sally Hemings. Um, he chose that because of who he was. And it probably had less to do with being, um, it didn't change how he felt about the institution of slavery, right? But it indicates something about him that, I mean, I'm not going to spoil my conclusion because I present a lot of evidence for it. But we learn more about Jefferson identifying with the privileged in England. He's the lord of the manor who gets the maid pregnant, and he deals with the Hemingses differently than an aristocrat in England would have done. But there's something about Jefferson sexuality and 18th century norms that we need to understand in order to come closer to uh, understanding his motives and his choices. And, it's not, there's no simple answer because it requires first understanding the nuances. He's living inside a cultural bubble. We're living inside a very different cultural bubble. So to reconstitute that 18th century bubble is why we have professional cultural historians going in all different directions with different subspecialties, researching um, what it was like to live in that place at that time. And that's why this biography of Jefferson as an emotional life of an elusive historical figure um, shows both positive and negative attributes, but I try hard not to pass judgment before I treat the evidence in an 18th century context and not on the basis of current day morality.
Hmm. Absolutely. And that's one of the things I think that makes this so powerful is that you place him in deep in his own context, which is fair. You said he had a rich capacity to hate as a politician. And one of the really interesting parts of your book are the four people that he hated the most, I think: Patrick Henry, Alexander Hamilton, John Marshall, and Aaron Burr. And by the way, I should say, for those interested in reading the best book on Aaron Burr, that would be Fallen Founder by the aforementioned Nancy Eisenberg. That is a fabulous book. And I really, and I think you've done Burr justice. You can't help but feel for him. And you also talk about, of course, who he loved: his wife Patty, his daughter Patsy, and I want to make a point about her as well, Maria Cosway, and you delve into that, and of course Sally Hemings. All of these are very difficult to get into. You do about as good a job as I think as can be done from this vantage point, considering he burned all the correspondence between he and his wife. The interesting thing that you said about his daughter Patsy was that he came back from Paris and basically offered her up to a as a 17-year-old in marriage, knowing full well that he like all of the people in his class, as you say, and I'm putting quotes around that, believed that the marriage was for breeding. Women were for breeding. That's what wives were supposed to do. Jefferson's wife had done that. He knew full well that his daughter was going to do that. And so, sort of saying, before we understand, I think one of the ways we can understand his relationship with the teenage Sally Hemings is to look at the relationship between he and the teenage daughter that he had and clearly loved, but knew full well what was going to happen once she got married.
Precisely. Now, Patsy was dutiful to his death. She never said no to him. And she married Tom Randolph, a Randolph. Tom Randolph's father was well known to Jefferson, and Jefferson's father was uh, intimate with the extended Randolph clan. But 17-year-old Patsy, on return from France in early 1790, she was married at Monticello. Um, when she didn't know Tom Randolph very well, her husband, but she also couldn't talk back to her father if she wanted to wait before marrying. And she gave birth, I think, to 12 children, um, which again was part of their culture, the idea that a woman is meant to breed the next generation, and knowing that maybe a third of the children, in her case, only one died young, but something like a quarter or a third of children died before the age of 6. from weakness, illness. So that was their world. And Jefferson was socially conservative. So he believed um, that she, Patsy, should abide by her husband's will, her husband's wishes. And her husband turned out to be a monster. And they lived apart later on for some period of time. And Jefferson did his best to maintain close relations with Tom Randolph, who was a politician himself, served in Congress when Jefferson was president. And um, there were other models. He could have been different. When he was in France, the Marquis de Condorcet, he was very close to. Condorcet is known as the last of the philosophes. He was Voltaire's literary executor. He was born the same year as Jefferson. They bonded. He wrote in French reflections on Negro slavery in 1788. Jefferson was excited about it, an anti-slavery book. He started to translate it, the first chapter anyway, before he was called back to the US. And he, uh, at the same time, knew that Condorcet had just gotten married to a younger woman. They had a loving relationship, despite some 15 years difference in their ages. And Condorcet wrote, and no doubt spoke with Jefferson about his feelings of a woman's intellectual equality, social equality that they would work for in France. And that, I mean, this is even before Mary Wollstonecraft, 1792, Vindication of the Rights of Women. Condorcet was what we would call a progressive feminist today. And so Jefferson was very close to people in Europe who had progressive ideas about anti-slavery, about proto-feminism. And yet, as soon as he came back to Virginia, he devolved into that old-fashioned, patriarchal, just, refusing to, he was just so enamored with the Virginia ideal that, expressed by Monticello's very existence, that there's this agrarian paradise. And the expansion west of America was only going to further embody this Monticellian agrarian paradise, where he saw ordinary farmers taking advantage of this bountiful land, with their wives, breeding healthy families to help on the farm. And to him, the urban squalor of European cities, or, he didn't want to see a Hamiltonian future which would concentrate wealth in the cities and power in the cities and population in the cities. And it was unhealthy. And so, the agrarian utopia that Jefferson forecast, and in one of his typical hyperboles, it would take a 1,000th generation before the continent of America would be filled up. That, even with the Lewis and Clark expedition, what was found and brought back gave Jefferson further hope of an unlimited agrarian paradise. And he could not see it when one of his cabinet members, Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin, recommended that Jefferson hire women in federal um, positions, Jefferson scoffed at it. He thought it was ridiculous. So there were a number of people in Jefferson's orbit who openly encouraged what we would consider to be progressive policies. And, just as Jefferson and Washington before him did not see it in their political interest to advance anti-slavery, um, neither did Jefferson consider improving the lot of women. And he knew plenty of intellectually sophisticated women. Women were allowed to write history. This was something they could do in their study at home. But he thought it was ugly for a woman to be too public. Very, very backward by our standards. So the world of women for him was a world in which, I mean, his own wife, did she have a choice of, she had difficult pregnancies. Her life was in jeopardy more than once.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as though contraception didn't exist, but he wanted, I think, he wanted so badly for her to bear a son who would live to take over the family name and Jefferson's political legacy. I mean, fortunately, he had a grandson who would do that. But in the 1770s and early 1780s, I think he kept, if he ever thought of preserving his wife's health, it's very possible that the cultural impetus to produce sons and the fact that the only son that she bore died in infancy, maybe he kept trying till he had a couple of sons. And I mean, there are so many ways in which the 18th century Virginia mindset is deeply foreign. Just as their language of nervous sensation, of human passions, of sexual appetites need to be teased out so that before we pass judgment, we understand what they were up against. If they were even in a position to challenge the mores of the time. This is why I love doing history. There's always more to know.
And that brings us to a question and this could go on for hours because there's so much in this book that I would love to ask you about. I want to be mindful of your time. You've mentioned more than once, and the listeners of this podcast know we are rapidly approaching July 4th, 2026, the 250th anniversary of that momentous date, which will also, of course, be the bicentennial of Jefferson's death. Um, where This is a twofold question. One is, where does Andy Burstein, the scholar, stand after a career and a lifetime spent studying this very complex individual, fascinating, maddening, all at the same time? Where does he stand with you? But then as a country, as we approach this anniversary, where is the proper place? And that may not be the right way, but where do we place him? What is it that how should we feel about him at the end of the day? When we look at that monument, when we look at the man, when we visit Monticello, how should we feel about him?
Well, for one, he was a Renaissance man, and there's no way to belittle him, belittle his intellect, his curiosity. Um, He's the most intriguing figure in America at that time, for me. How he dealt with the power he was given makes him a suitable subject for psychological evaluation, but also we know that he believed, for example, in the rights of conscience. That's the prime directive for Jefferson, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. He was so proud of this, the rights of conscience. A man can tell me that there's 20 gods or no God. It doesn't pick my pocket. It doesn't break my leg. He wrote that in Notes on the State of Virginia in the early 1780s. As he and his associate Madison were at that time, seeking in the Virginia legislature to pass what became the Virginia Statute and is embodied in the First Amendment of the Constitution. Thank you, Madison. Well, self-taught architect, mathematical prodigy. And the words that he wrote to Dr. Benjamin Rush, yet another signer of the Declaration that encircled the interior of the Jefferson Memorial, thank you, Franklin Roosevelt. I have sworn for the altar of God, eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. Tyranny over the mind. It's like seeing bigotry as a disease. Theoretically, Jefferson was an Enlightenment humanist, and we should admire him for these beliefs. On his inability, whatever the cause, whether it was intellectual, political cowardice, his inability to see African American achievement as intellectual, cultural. He denied a poetic consciousness to African Americans generically. And there is so much contrary evidence in his time, and he refused to go back on his, what we refer to as scientific racism, this belief in this human taxonomy and European America, Europeans are inherently more beautiful physically, more intellectually endowed. All of these prejudices, someone as philosophical and widely read in the classics, going back to Greece and Rome. I think, when we finally pass judgment on Jefferson on the subject of race and racial prejudice, there's no way to find any decent rationale or justification for his pronouncements. He never went back on those. And so he should be criticized as a public man for not taking up issues that he could have based on his cosmopolitanism, his engagement with great minds of Europe. He had exposure. Hamilton never went to Europe. Madison never went to Europe. Washington never went to Europe. Jefferson had a deep and abiding understanding of the old world, and yet he never incorporated the progressive ideals that he was introduced to, but just relied on the old Virginia ways. And I, historians shouldn't say, well, if he lived to 1861, he would have been on the side of the Union or the side of the Confederacy. But just suggestively, I'll say that Madison would have strongly stayed with the Union, and Jefferson would have had a hard time deciding and ultimately would have gone with the Confederacy. So that's the way I feel about Jefferson and his failure to improve his understanding or his his stubbornness in failing to see what was right in front of him very often.
So I mentioned you are the first face we see in the Ken Burns documentary on Thomas Jefferson in 1997, and it famously ended with Clay Jenkinson talking about Nunc dimentis, now you may dismiss me. Is this Andrew Burstein's last word on Jefferson? Have you dismissed him?
I don't know if dismiss is the right verb.
And I know you'll
Um,
continue to do many interviews like this one over the course of the next year.
well, I'm settled on my. This was the culmination of a career of studying Jefferson in the context of his time, and I don't see myself writing further on Jefferson. I'm enjoying my retirement. It's possible that Nancy and I might uh, go back to the archive and do something together. But barring that, I haven't yet bought a set of golf clubs, but I am enjoying uh, this time of life.
Well, the book is entitled Being Thomas Jefferson, An Intimate History. It's published by Bloomsbury. It came out on January 13th of this year. Andy Burstein, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for a lifetime of scholarship and helping us understand not only this seminal figure in American history, but so many others as well. Continued good luck in everything that you're doing.
Well, thank you so much, Stan. I really enjoyed our conversation.
My thanks to Andy Burstein for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at bloomsbury.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. If you're a fan of Today in Georgia History, and who isn't, check it out at the completely redesigned website at todayingeorgiahistory.org, and you can see it and hear it currently airing twice a day on TV and radio on Georgia Public Broadcasting. You can find this podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including YouTube and YouTube Music. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app, which would be most helpful and appreciated. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow, subscribe, and share with a friend. And drop me a line at sdeaton@georgiahistory.com. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. You can also treat yourself to every podcast, every blog, and every video entitled Dispatches from Off the Beaten Path at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.